Well, first to establish the date. Today is June 10th. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1977.
1977?
Sorry, a little confused. I still think I'm a young guy. 1997. Okay.
That was better the other way.
You want some interesting stories, which I have about my father and your wife's grandfather. I'll tell you a little incident on how a Jewish soldier. Are you getting this?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, you're not looking in there. Okay. How a Jewish soldier in the Tsar's army became a master sergeant. Took some doing. My father was married at 18.
Sign.
And by the time he was 21, which evidently was the year or the age that he was drafted into the Tsar's army, he had 2 children. And many Jews at that time, rather than serve in the Tsar's army, ran away. They have a Jewish phrase, gun for the grenade, steal over the border and come to the United States or wherever. My father chose not to. He told my mother, if you have to go, you have to go, and so he went into the army. One day, I should say one weekend, when all the soldiers were out into town doing what soldiers do on liberty, my father would stay in a barracks. He wasn't interested in other women or getting drunk or what. And he had nothing to do. Right next to his bunk, they had this religious symbol, an icon, a religious, I don't know, a painting or something with a candle stuck in it. So he figured, well, if I can get something to read, I have the light, I can lay in my bunk and read. Looking around, he couldn't find anything, no newspapers, no magazines. So he got hold of someone he knew who came from his village or town or whatever, and he was in supply. He asked him, do you have anything here that I can read? Books, magazines? No, he says, all I have is the manuals from the cannon. Oh, my father was in an artillery outfit. Eight cannon was made up the unit. So he said, all right, give me the manuals, I'll read them. And I guess he had the Gorowski memory, because subsequently in training, whenever they would ask questions or anything, my father knew all the answers. This led to his being promoted and eventually becoming Master Sergeant, or top kick of the outfit. Well, when he finally got to where the fighting was going on, this is, by the way, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, Manchuria. By the time they got there, they had gotten into, well, I don't know how to explain it, but evidently there was a battle, and the Japanese zeroed in and really hit my father's outfit hard, putting every cannon out of commission, killing a lot of the men, wounded, and so on. My father luckily survived, he wasn't hit, but what he did, being the Master Sergeant, he rallied the men together, got one of the cannon back into firing position, and kept on firing until word came through to fall back. Evidently they spiked the guns and fell back. Subsequently, some high officer said, by the way, who's responsible for that one gun continuing to fire? He said, oh, Sergeant Gorowski, or Gorovsky, or however the Russians say it. My father was decorated. That's his experience in the army. They didn't go into action again because, as my father explained, the Japanese sort of conquered, I don't know how, they took their flag. And he says, once they take your flag, you don't exist until you get it back. So my father was lucky enough not to have to go into action again, and subsequently went home, and that was the experience in the army. Okay, enough, gee whiz. Got it now.
All right.
When I was somewhere between 13 and 14, we moved from Williamsburg up to Flatbush, and moving is putting it kindly. Actually, we couldn't pay our rent. It was the middle of the Depression, and we moved in with my sister, married sister Bertha. I went out in the street to play, and pretty soon there was some other kids around my age. And suddenly one kid says to another kid, says, "What does your father do?" Of course, most of the time the answer was nothing, unemployed. But one kid said, "My father's a boss in a shipyard." Well, my ears sort of perked up. Boss in a shipyard? I got a hold of him and said, "Hey Richie, can your father get my father a job?" He says, "I'll ask him." His father, aside from being the yard superintendent of this shipyard in Hoboken called Fletcher's, he also owned a garage about 3 or 4 blocks from where we lived. There was a street and it had a bunch of garages on it, and one of the things he invested his money in was this garage. And after he would work, he'd go to the garage to check out what was going on and so on. So Richie evidently went down there to see his father and asked him. Next day he says to me, "I spoke to my father and he said for your father to come down to the garage." So I got a hold of my father that night and I said, "Pa, I got this friend, his father's a big boss in a shipyard, and I asked him if he can get you a job, and he said to come down and he'll talk to you." So my father, being unemployed as everybody else was, he had lost his business, and he went down to the garage and he spoke to the guy. Of course, my father spoke with a Russian accent, but he was in his 40s, mid-40s at that time, and pretty strong looking. I guess the guy wanted to make sure he wasn't 4'10" and weighed 80 pounds. So he said, "Okay," he says, "report to the shipyard tomorrow for the 4 o'clock shift." That would be 4 to 12. 4 to 1. I know it was 8 hours an hour for lunch, whatever, supper. So my father went down there, and sure enough, they sort of shaped up. And the boss would come out, and he knew exactly how many men he needed and what skills, ship fitter, riveter, burner, working in a plate shop, and so on. What helpers he needed, and he would just sort of point or nod, look at somebody and nod, and you'd walk in. I still remember, I was just getting into high school at the time, and I couldn't sleep. My father shows up about 1:30 in the morning or so, dirty, nowhere to wash up in a shipyard and all. And I asked him, "How was it, Pa?" He says, "It's a job." I said, "What are they paying you?" In Yiddish, he says, "Ich hab nicht gefragt." I didn't ask him. You were so happy to get a job, you didn't ask him what you're going to be paid. And my father worked there quite a while. And when I got out of high school, that's where I ended up, in the shipyard as a helper. An interesting thing happened. After 2 or 3 days, my father was outside the shipyard. Somebody in the back hit him in the head with a bottle, and he went down. He had a lacerated scalp. He had to have stitches and all, and I guess he didn't go into work that night. But he saw who it was. As he went down, he turned around. The next day when he showed up, he crossed the street where there was a big saloon. He knew this guy liked to have a few before work. And he stood there. Pretty soon this guy comes out. My father walks up to him and says, "Why did you do that?" He says to my father, "You effing Jew bastard, you come from New York to take our jobs away? Our job?" And with it, my father hauls off and gives him a shot. Down he goes. My father grabs him, as my father told me this years later, around the thing, lifted him off the ground, belted him again, and down he went. He picks him up again, at which point, all the guys that were shaping up, hundreds of guys, including the boss, was watching this. And he hollers across, "Joe, that's enough." My father let him go and walked across. Needless to say, in the years my father worked there, on and off, whenever there was work, nobody touched my father. He was the only Jew out of about 600 guys in the shipyard. When I went in, I was the second Jew. Anyway, that's enough, Kenny. I'm telling you.
It's not, something's wrong. It's not going on. What the hell's wrong with this?
Maybe you didn't get any of this.
No, I got it all. I got it all.
I remember seeing his hat. He had a cap.
Nothing's wrong.
And it was, I might add, they like my father. The sad part is that the shipyard is a dangerous place to work. And of all things, This superintendent of the shipyard, he was the top guy, was standing on a pier between two dry docks. And I was working in the shipyard at that time as a helper with his son, Richie. Richie then was also 18, 19, whatever. And they were lifting a load of lumber, I guess for staging on the ship. I still remember it was in the export line, the Exeter, something like that. But as they were lifting this load of lumber, they had a single sling around it. It tipped, and a plank slid out.
Wow.
And hit him behind the head and killed him. My friend's father, the boss of the whole yard, was killed right in the shipyard.
That's
I
incredible.
was working there, and interesting, my father wasn't. He was on jury duty, of all things. And I didn't know how to tell my father at night that Harry Viggers, that was the boss's name, his son was Richie Viggers, that he was killed. My father liked him, he liked my father. After a while, as this guy actually came to our house, he was separated from his wife, but he supported her, gave them every week a certain amount of money, paid the rent and money for clothes and all, and he had a girlfriend on the side. Well, one of the reasons was Richie's mother, you can see, was a very pretty, at one time, a very pretty woman. But she got to be like 200 pounds, and he was still a young-looking guy and all. And I guess, you know, he felt, geez, you know, he's a little embarrassed to have this big fat broad. But one thing and another, he got himself another girl. And believe it or not, they used to come to my house, they'd have coffee and cake and stuff.
The girlfriend.
Yeah, he liked my father, he really liked my father. And the interesting thing is that after he was killed, my father had preference. If there was any work, see, it was a repair yard. They worked like hell until the ship was fixed. They had leaking plates or rusted out plates, steel plates on a hull. They would work, because you can't, every day that a ship is tied up and dry dock, it's thousands of dollars. So you'd work, sometimes you'd work through the night and all. Sometimes, geez, I'd work 16, 18 hours. And the ship would go out, and sometimes there wouldn't be another one. You just shape up, no work, you turn around and you go home. That was quite a trip too. From Flatbush, you take the subway to 23rd Street, Manhattan, 7th Avenue. Then you walked all the way to the Hudson River, 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, 11th Avenue, 12th. That's to save a nickel for the bus. Then you took a ferry across, and the shipyard was right there on the water, next to the ferry slip. Took an hour to an hour and a half. And you'd have to show up. Boy, if you didn't show up to shape up, and it was work, they wouldn't pick you.
You also worked in Boston, right?
Well, I went to work in the Navy Yard as a helper, shipfitter helper. They were building the North Carolina 35,000-ton battleship. Saw a lot of action in World War II. And I worked there about a year, and they had a school. After you worked, I worked from 8 to 5, 8 hours an hour for lunch. I went to school for 2 hours where I learned how to read blueprints and learned all the stuff about ships, all the names of different things and so on, and this and that. And I'm like a sponge, boy, I soaked it up. Well, one thing and another, I left the Navy Yard, and I wanted to go out as a mechanic. The trouble is, I was only about 20, 21 years old at the time, and I looked more like 17, 18. And, you know, of course, in order to be a mechanic, ship fitter, you should either go through 4 years as an apprentice or a lot of years as a helper until you learn enough as a helper to become a ship fitter. But it didn't take me that long. Once I saw something, I could even see better ways of doing things than the guy was doing it. And luckily, when I was in the Navy Yard, the fitter that I was his helper, his name was Bill Grinley, and he liked to drink. This guy would get paid on Friday. On Monday, he'd come in and borrow lunch money from me. He was broke. He would drink it all up over the weekend. His pay was like $37, $38, which is a lot of money at the time. I had good pay too in the Navy Yard. It was about $24, $23.70, $22.48, something like that. But it was a very good pay. Anyway, about February or so, 1941. That's before Pearl Harbor. I got a card from New York State Unemployment. You would register, and if they ever had a job, they would let you know. And of course, they never had a job because there were simply too many people wanting jobs and not enough jobs. But all of a sudden, I get a card to come down for an interview as ship fitter. That's what I registered with them, as a ship fitter, not expected to get anything. And I went up there, a great big building where this thing was, and I go to the place where I was supposed to see someone, and there's this guy sitting there in a beautiful dark suit. I remember he had a red, sort of a reddish tie, nice white shirt, very distinguished looking guy. Name was George White, Mr. White. And he looks at me, and I sit down, and he looked very skeptical, starts to ask me questions. And I answered him, you know, about ships, this. He was vice president, by the way, of a shipyard in Boston. I didn't know this. I didn't know who he was. All I know is, hey, this is the guy that might hire me. So then he says, I see on your application that you worked in oh, that was another shipyard. I worked way up on City Island. I went from Brooklyn, Flatbush, to City Island. And although I was supposed to get a job as a ship fitter, they wouldn't pay me. I did ship fitter work, but they would only pay me 50 cents an hour. I said, to hell with it, I need the experience. So I worked there for a while. Anyway, it was a yacht building yard. They used to build yachts for millionaires, you know. And they had a contract for tugboats for Pearl Harbor, of all things. And that's why they needed ship fitters. I don't know how I got up there. Somebody either told me or tipped me or said, hey, you know, they're hiring up on City Island. And I went up there or something, and I was hired. But anyway, to get back, this guy, Mr. White, said, I see you worked in Robert Jacobs Shipyard. What I didn't know is that he knew all these yacht building yards, because the place that he was vice president of was Lawley Shipyard. This was a shipyard in Boston, Neponset, Boston. Well, Neponset is like a suburb of Boston, but it's part of it. And they had a contract for sub chasers for the Navy. They used to build yachts. They used to build, as a matter of fact, racing yachts, big yachts. They built the American Cup Defender when they used to race against the Thomas Lipton Shamrock. That was the name of his yacht. It was the America or the Columbia, I don't remember. But anyway, he said, what did you do up there? I did everything. I did welding, I did burning, I was a ship fitter, I did my own work in a plate shop. He said, you're hired. Gives me his card. Then I say, Boston. Oh, geez, who wants to go to Boston? But I thought it over, and a couple of weeks later, I decided, hell, I'm not doing anything here. And here he's going to hire me as a ship fitter, $1 an hour. I packed some clothes, my work clothes, my tools, took a bus up there, got off at the last stop of a trolley car. After I got off the bus terminal, I took a trolley to Neponset. And the shipyard was like 2 blocks away from Neponset Circle. And I walked down there, and there was a timekeeper. He said, yeah, what do you want? I took out the card. I said, Mr. White told me to, Mr. White. He says, yes, okay, what's your name, and so on, and this and this. He said, okay, you report. This was about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. He said, report tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. So I asked him, by the way, I said, I just got off the bus. I don't even have a place to sleep. I said, is there any place around here you know where I can get a room or something? He says, gee, what a coincidence. Just this morning, a guy up the block, right on the corner, a White House on Walnut, he came down and said if he has some rooms to rent. Oh, I went up there, knocked on the door, this woman answered, and I said, I understand you have a room to rent. He says, oh yes, come on in. Came in, she took me upstairs, a beautiful room with 2 beds. He says, if you want to share it with someone, it's $3 a week. But if you want it by yourself, it's $4. I says, I'll take it for myself. I don't want somebody else. And I took the room. The next morning, I reported for work. And I worked there. Pearl Harbor came along, of course, December 7th. Before that, I used to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, Saturday and Sunday off. Sometimes I'd come back to New York. Friday night I'd take the bus, and then Sunday night I'd take the bus back. But once Pearl Harbor happened, we worked 7 days a week straight. I remember getting a day off after 6 weeks. They gave us a day off. And not only that, we worked overtime. It was nothing to work 14, 16, 18 hours a day. One thing they needed was sub-chasers. The Germans were sinking our ships like mad, and they needed them. Well, I worked. In November of '42, I gave up my job, gave up my deferment. Oh, I got a letter from my draft board. My father sent it to me. And I was to report to the draft board. So I wrote them a letter back. I said, I'm working as a ship fitter in a shipyard. And I was in charge of a whole crew up there. I said, if I have to come down, my crew gets laid off. And the implication being, you know, we're in a war. So I mailed him the letter, and I don't know how long it took, a week or so later, the foreman, Harry Castle, I was at that time working outside. I was making bulkheads for these sub-chasers. He says, hey, Gorowski, this came from you. And he scales it. I remember the thing scaling, you know, it was a piece of cardboard. And I pick it up. It was from the draft board. I was deferred.
Good.
Well, I kept working until, as I say, November. Then I just felt I had to go in. My brother Fred was in. My other friends were in. My very good friend Tom Owens, Leo Silverman. And I said, gee, my kid says to me, gee, Daddy, what did you do in the war? I didn't want to say, oh, I worked in a shipyard. Well, I'll bet you've been taking us all down, haven't you? You rat. Knock it off, I'm going to go in the house now or something. Let's